Hi, loves. Welcome back to our Monday interview show. I am so excited to have a very special guest on our podcast today, Dr. Kristin Neff, who is the author of this wonderful book, Fierce Self-Compassion: How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Kristin is an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, and she is a pioneer in the field of self-compassion research. She's been doing studies on self-compassion for over 20 years. So, Dr. Kristin, thank you so much for joining us here today in this very important topic around self-compassion.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you.
I'm so excited to get into this because there's a part in the book in the beginning where you talk about how there's some kind of practice where you write out how you would speak to your friend and how you would speak to yourself and how different it is. And for many of
Yes.
us, we'll get to the gender part in a moment, Kristin, but all of us, it seems to be so much easier to be compassionate with others. Is that just
Yeah,
how
and
we're
there are some
wired?
pretty strong reasons. There were strong reasons for that. So don't beat yourself up if you beat yourself up. One of the reasons is just how our brains work. When we feel personally threatened, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. And if the threat is ourself, we've done something wrong or stressed, we turn that response inward and we beat ourselves up. We fight ourselves to try to control things, or we flee into a sense of shame and isolation, or we freeze and we get stuck. Whereas with our friends, we aren't so personally threatened if they're struggling in
Mm.
some way. And so it's easier to use the care system, which also evolved, but it really evolved to take care of our family members and our in-group members. And so if evolution wasn't reason enough, also culturally, we're raised to be compassionate to others, but people don't really talk about the importance of being compassionate and supportive to yourself. So it's not entirely natural. The good news is that because we know how to be a good friend to others, we have the template for how to treat ourselves.
So this is something we can learn through these practices and rewire those patterns.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's good
Yeah.
news.
Yeah.
So writing the subtitle, what struck me first was, you're talking about women, and your first two chapters get into this and around gender because self-compassion, of course, is important for all humans. But can you tell us about why this book focuses so much for women?
Yeah. And so really, so gender role socialization plays a role in the expression of self-compassion. To be clear, I'm not talking about biological sex or even gender identity. If you're trans or non-binary, it's really how are you raised as a child? What
Mm,
shoebox were you put in? The pink shoebox or the blue shoebox? And so, first of all, there are different ways, different forms of self-compassion, what I like to call the fierce and the tender. So the tender
yes.
self-compassion is more about acceptance, whereas fierce self-compassion is more about taking action, maybe speaking up, drawing boundaries. And because of gender role socialization, people raised as boys aren't allowed to be tender. They
Mm,
might get beat up or bullied if they're considered too sensitive. And that's a shame because tender self compassion is really the healing power of self compassion. It's what allows us to accept our difficult emotions, to accept ourselves, and it gives us a lot of strength and resilience. Whereas a fierce self compassion is all about taking action. And boys, they're encouraged to take action, but people raised as girls, I mean, there's some, flexibility in the early kind of tomboy years. But later on, if girls are considered too action oriented, we think, girls or women are aggressive or self
yes.
promoting or too ambitious, right?
Attention seeking, or yeah, all sorts of
Yes,
labels.
exactly. And if women are, for goodness sake, angry, so a man who's angry, people believe him more. They think he's passionate. But a woman who's angry, they think she's crazy. And
Yes.
so that's the reason I wrote my book for people who identify as women. It's just because it was too complicated to write a book saying, well, for men it works this way, for women it
Right.
works that way. And also it was I wrote the book when it was right in the midst of the Me Too movement.
Yes.
And I realized that one of the reasons, it kind of took so long for many women to speak up was I mean, there's a lot of reasons, including reasons of power, but part of it was just we're socialized not to speak up. we're socialized not to make waves, and people don't like us if we say, no, I'm sorry, I really don't like that, or if we draw boundaries. And so that's really what I wanted to explore, because how can we be compassionate and care for ourselves if we don't feel comfortable speaking up or saying no or drawing a boundary? And
Yes.
that really harms people raised as women, that they're socialized not to do that, because people want women to be nice, which means being doormats, basically.
Yes, and it's that range, as you talked about, really embracing the whole self. So we have these different tools in our tool belt, sometimes the acceptance, sometimes the, being more forward speaking and clear in our boundaries.
Exactly. So I use the metaphor of yin and yang. The yang energy is more the
Yes.
active energy, the yin is more accepting. And according to Chinese philosophy, which I think gets it right, we need both to be healthy. That's why there's that symbol, and both are in balance. And so what happens in society, because of gender role socialization, people aren't allowed to be healthy because they aren't allowed to be balanced.
Right.
And so that's really, if we want to be our true authentic selves, and everyone will express these energies in unique ways. But if we want to be healthy, we need to be allowed to be our true authentic selves. And if we're not allowed to be one way or the other because society tells us, it goes against gender role socialization, well, that harms everyone.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love how you also talk about kindness a lot in your book. And I'd love for you to explain to us how we can be kind and also assertive, and how that also interplays with anger, because you have this interesting chapter about being an angry woman. And sometimes we hear, anger is, underneath it, there's pain. So can we use our voice, stay kind, and not have to be explosively angry? It seems like this is one of those like erratic emotions that isn't
Yes,
healthy.
yes. Well, so it's interesting to think of fierce self-compassion as a form of kindness. So kindness isn't always just soft and tender and sweet.
That's right.
I like to call it mama bear self-compassion. So that mama bear energy, and by the way, everyone has access to it, whether or not you're a parent or your gender identity, is kind of fierce protective energy.
Oh,
That's
yes.
an ultimate act of kindness. Think of the firefighter who pulls out some children who are about to be engulfed by flames. That's an act of kindness, an act of courage and bravery. And so an act of kindness for ourselves means sometimes we have to be brave and courageous. And anger has a role in this. So there's, in psychology, there's what's considered destructive anger and constructive anger. And there's both. Very easy to tell the difference. Destructive anger causes harm.
Mm,
Constructive anger prevents harm.
mm.
Right? So think about this. If someone's about to attack you and as anger arises, and you don't have to even dehumanize the person who's attacking you, but you certainly have to act quickly and bravely and strongly to say, no, that's not okay. And that type of anger, which is aimed at preventing harm, is actually helpful. But it really does come down to, are you dehumanizing others? Once
Ah,
you dehumanize other people, then it's just destructive. Then you're kind of feeding the same energy of maybe the person who's trying to harm you. But if it's just a very clear, no, that's not okay. You're a human being. It doesn't mean you're, not worthy as a human being, but you can't do this to me, because my needs count too. That type of anger. See, the
that
thing
doesn't
about
even
anger,
sound like anger, Kristen. That sounds like clear.
well, yes, but sometimes there's angry energy. So anger, this is an evolved emotion. This is one of the
Yes.
basic human emotions that evolved to do a few things to energize us, right? So anger, when we get that rush of anger, part of the reason it's helpful is because it can energize us. It can get us to act. It suppresses the fear response. Think about it. When you're angry about something, you're less worried about, what's going to happen to me or what are they going to do. It also focuses us. Anger is a very focusing emotion.
Mm.
So, I mean, do you call it anger or not? If you're just defining anger as destructive anger, no, it's not. But that energy, that physiological arousal,
Mm-hmm.
cortisol, for instance, of the
Mm-hmm.
anger, focuses us, helps us be brave, lets people know there's a problem that needs to be addressed. So that part of the anger can actually be helpful. Because if we aren't angry at some of the injustices going on in the world, then we're probably asleep. But again, we don't have to dehumanize
Yes.
anyone in order to feel that kind of call to action to protect.
Kristin, are you familiar with some of the yogic Hindu deities, these archetypes? Because as you're speaking, I'm
Yes.
picturing Kali, right? She's
Yes.
got the tongue out, the skulls, the most
Yes.
fierce. She's, smashing out the injustices and the ego, but they say she is the most compassionate.
I have a picture of her on my wall for
There
that
you
reason.
go.
Yes, exactly. And so it is fearsome, but
Yes.
what Kali destroys is the illusion of separation. She
Yes.
destroys injustice. So it is actually an ultimate act of kindness and compassion. And so that's why people are confused. They think that compassion is only soft and squishy. It isn't. It can be very strong, very fierce even. But the thing is, what's the aim? What
Yes.
are people aiming for? If you're aiming to prevent harm, to bring connection and togetherness, then it actually can be a powerful force for good and kindness.
Kristin, your work also reminds me of Durga. So I'm
Yes.
really into yoga as well because she has 10 arms, 10 weapons that we use at
Yes.
certain times. So sometimes she has the book for knowledge. Sometimes she brings the
Hmm.
lotus flower for peace. Sometimes she brings that sword to cut through
Yes.
BS, right? And sometimes she has her bow and arrow to take aim. So it sounds like your work is really around creating these tools so a woman can be intuitive and say, hey, this feels like I need to be assertive or more accepting.
Yes.
Pivot.
Well, and everyone really, again, regardless of gender identity, one way. So in psychology, compassion isn't defined as an emotion; it's defined as a motivation. In
Oh,
particular, it's the motivation to alleviate suffering. And so, really, the act of compassion is asking yourself, well, what do I need to alleviate my suffering? And then the answer to that question
mm,
is just going to depend on your situation. Sometimes we need to take a break. Sometimes we need to go easier on ourselves. Sometimes we need to kick ourselves in the pants to get off the couch and do something. Sometimes we need to protect ourselves. Sometimes we need to, be more peaceful. It really just depends on the situation. That's why, a lot of these deities have so many arms because it never
yes.
looks exactly one way. And if we pigeonhole ourselves into thinking compassion only looks one way, then we're limiting our ability to help.
Mm. So, can you talk to us a little bit about guilt? Because I know myself and a lot of women have a lot of guilt. I didn't do this enough, or I'm a recovering perfectionist personally. And
Yes.
that takes a lot of energy to sort of rehash things. And, we can learn lessons, but we can't
Yes.
take back the past. So, can you tell a little bit about your program and your research around guilt?
Yeah. And so I think you're also talking about a few different things. There's also making mistakes, which is more general. So, guilt in particular is when you've harmed someone and you feel badly about harming someone, right? So, guilt actually can be healthy to the extent that it leads to making repairs. So, if
Mm-hmm.
you have harmed someone, maybe apologizing or try to come to some sort of understanding. As opposed to shame, which is about, instead of I made a mistake, it's like I am a mistake. Shame is
Yes.
self-referential. It's all about um, really it's feeling the self as unworthy because of something you've done.
Right.
Shame is not healthy. Shame actually doesn't usually help the person you've harmed or yourself. Guilt, as long as it's healthy guilt and isn't accompanied by, I'm a terrible person or, if as long as it's appropriate, it can be healthy. I'm not making mistakes. Sometimes we may feel guilty but more often it's more like we feel shame. I made a mistake. Maybe I didn't study right and I didn't get the outcome I needed. Then we might feel shame
Mm-hmm.
or harsh self-criticism. So the beautiful thing about self-compassion is it allows us to learn from our mistakes. If
Yes.
we feel shame because of our mistakes, what it means is we may give up, or we may be so full of shame, we just can't see clearly because we're just hanging our head in shame. It also means we develop fear of failure. We aren't willing to take learning risks. If we know that if we try and fail, we're going to shame ourselves. So the research is very clear that self-compassion is a more effective motivator than self-criticism and shame because it means we try our best. if we don't reach our goal, we say, oh, well, that's only human. That's how people learn. How can I learn from this? What might I do differently next time? So people are more motivated to keep trying even after setbacks. They have less performance anxiety because it's not such a big deal if they try and they fail, and they persist longer in their efforts. So it's actually a good thing to motivate yourself with compassion and kindness. Again, you can't lie to yourself and say, oh, well, so what? I didn't do well and it doesn't really matter. Because if it does matter, then you want to say, I really messed up. How can I do something differently next time? But as long as you're honest and you're giving yourself constructive criticism as opposed to, shameful, destructive criticism, it's actually a very, very helpful mind state.
And you mentioned mindfulness. So first we have to be aware of that self-talk. And then
Yes.
through your work, then we can say, okay, I'm going down this path. Now I can choose this other path until that becomes the norm.
Yes. There's actually 3 components to self-compassion, and they're all essential. So the first thing that really happens is mindfulness. So mindfulness is the ability to be aware of what's happening as it's happening. So we need to be aware that we're suffering, for instance, as opposed to just pretending like I'm just going to get through it and I'm not going to acknowledge that I'm having a hard time. Or else what happens is we get lost in our suffering and there's no perspective. So we need mindfulness to be aware of what's happening, but with some balance around it. And then we need the kindness, which we've talked about, the fact that we're constructive, we're encouraging, we're warm, we're helpful. But the third component we haven't mentioned yet, which is really key, I term common humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just the wisdom, the understanding that the human condition is imperfect. And we know this logically, but when we fail or we make a mistake or we feel badly about ourselves, kind of irrationally, we feel like I'm the only one this has happened to, or I'm the only one and everyone else is leading a normal, perfect life and it's just me who's failed. And that really makes our suffering so much worse because not only are we hurting, we feel all alone. We feel something's wrong with us because of what we're going through. So compassion, by definition, is a connected way of being, as opposed to pity. If I pity you, that means I look down on you. If I feel compassion for you, it means, hey, I've been there. I feel some connection to you. So it's the same thing with self-compassion. We feel connected to others in our struggles. And that helps us remember that we aren't alone, right? And that it's part of the human experience. So we don't have to be so upset about making mistakes. This is how we learn and grow.
Yes. And to like that softness that you mentioned instead of this rigidity and beating ourselves
Yes,
up, which just
exactly.
feels so like it builds over time, that stress.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've written a book that's coming out this later this fall about burnout.
Mm.
So one of the things is if you stress yourself out, first of all, life is stressful. Your job may be stressful. COVID was stressful. The world is stressful. And if you criticize yourself or you shame yourself, it makes it even doubly stressful.
Mm.
And that's why with all this stress, if you don't have the tools to cope with it, you're probably likely to burn out at some point, or maybe you're a caregiver and all your care goes outward and not inward. You're going to burn out from the stress of being a caregiver. So one of the really robust findings of the research is that self-compassion reduces stress and burnout. Because again, it gives you the resources to handle those stressful moments or those difficult moments. So when compassion flows inward, it gives you the resource to therefore have it continue to flow outward.
So in your work, Kristin, in your research, are you seeing that this work it's something that is happening in the moment? And there's also, is there a reflection piece of this where you can journal and write about it, right? Because in the moment, sometimes it's a bit murky when we're retraining.
Yes. So there are, as many ways to practice self-compassion as there are human beings. It's self-compassion is really just a mindset in which mindfulness, a sense of common humanity, and kindness are present. And there's so many ways to get there. So for some people, it may be just physical touch. Maybe just putting your hands on your heart, and that helps people feel more connected and warm and kind of present with themselves. Journaling, as you mentioned, is a really good way to practice self-compassion. You might either just write yourself a paragraph of mindfulness, turning your attention toward your difficulty, remembering you aren't alone with common humanity, and some words of kindness. Or it can just be a letter. You might say, what would I write to a friend who is going through something similar? Or maybe what would that English teacher who I adored in 7th grade, was so kind and compassionate, what would they write to me? There's a lot of different doorways in. There's some people, meditation works.
Yes.
Other times you can just really just evoke a more warm and spacious and connected mindset. Sometimes you can, again, think of your grandparent who loved you, if you were lucky enough to have such a grandparent, or your pet. It's funny, most people have some person they're very compassionate with, or if not a person, at least an animal in their life that they care about. Sometimes that can be a springboard for getting in touch with the feelings of compassion and then making a U-turn and turning them inward. So that's a really fun thing about figuring out how to teach people self-compassion, is there's so many doorways in.
I love how you said to touch your heart, Kristin. And
Yeah.
my next books are about heart coherence and the science of
Ah,
going into self-regulating yourself through the heart. And for me, that's what's really worked, because I'm getting out of the thoughts that are
yes.
like, repetitive and come fast and furious, and dropping into that deeper place gives you that pause and just makes me feel more expanded when I'm in here. And then the compassion, the peaceful thoughts have a chance to rise up.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, so the body, if you're responsive to something like touching your heart, is really one of the easiest and most powerful ways to practice self-compassion for a few reasons. One, as you mentioned, you're dropping out of your head, where
Yes.
usually the problems are and the self-criticism is, into your body, which is more grounded, it's more present. You're also changing your physiology. So this research shows that part of what you're
Yes.
doing is you're lowering your cortisol levels and you're increasing heart rate variability, which allows you to be responsive. So, there's a lot of different reasons why physical touch, especially warm and caring touch, is a very, very powerful way to practice self-compassion. And also, there's other ways you can do it. Like maybe your boss just said something and you need self-compassion. You probably don't want to go like this in front of your boss. You can just fold your arms, even, with an intention of caring for yourself. No one needs to know. Any
Well,
sort of physical touch with the intention to care is very useful.
that's right. I
Yeah.
think I read Peter Levine talk about making this sort of container for trauma, um,
Yes.
helping with trauma responses. But for me, Kristen, I either touch my heart, even if I shift to the heart, like you said, we don't always
Yes.
want to touch our heart in front of others, but it feels
Yes.
like it's making that shift. It's
Internally.
rewiring our nervous system.
Absolutely. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that, some of which we have scientific explanations for and some that we don't. But I can say from experience, it absolutely, if you can shift almost your sense of self from your head down into your heart, almost as if
Yes.
this was the center of your being, it really changes the way you approach things and relate to things.
So I was reading your book, and I'm just so interested in this. As you mentioned, a lot of the motivation for the book was around the Me Too movement and
Yeah.
women starting to voice up, hey, this happened to me. I was a victim of, a sexual predator or aggression or whatever it is. So when you're taking someone through these, so many emotions come up. But when you were
Mm.
talking about compassion, Kristen, you were saying, it's about connection and it's about like we're on equal footing, but we're this common humanity. How do you, let's say that person starts to feel compassion for themselves, that they, may have fallen prey to a certain situation. But then what do we do with the energy of anger or like the victim mindset, like anger at that person versus even though they may have created harm, working to find a compassionate place for where that person is and their limitations, the perpetrator.
Yeah. So
Is that
that's where the
clear? It's a long question.
no, but I mean, it's a good one, right? So that's where hopefully our anger can be constructive.
Yeah.
And by the way, if it's not, that's okay too. That's only human. I mean, if someone's harmed you, it's only natural
Yes.
to have feelings of destructive anger. And maybe there's a way you can channel them. The reason it's not that helpful, unfortunately, is that if there's the energy of a kind of dehumanization in your anger, even towards someone else, that's when sayings like, it's like picking up a hot coal to throw at someone else that actually harms you.
Yes.
So when you cut others out of this sense of humanity, and when you kind of harden your heart in this way, unfortunately, the person it really harms can be yourself. But saying, okay, you're a human being. I don't know your story, what your background is, what your genetics are, what caused you to be the way you are. You are a human being. And yet, boundary.
Mm.
I don't want anything to do with you, perhaps. So in other words, compassion doesn't necessarily mean forgiveness. Forgiveness in the sense of you're going to have normal relations with someone, that may never happen. And that's okay if in fact you decide that's the most self-compassionate thing to do. So, boundaries is kind of that distance at which Prentice Hemphill says, that distance in which, I can love you and myself simultaneously.
Yes.
And so, for instance, family members, maybe you have a really narcissistic family member. It may be the most compassionate thing to decide to draw a boundary and maybe even cut off contact for some period of time. It all depends on the situation. But it actually can be a form of love if, in fact, keeping that relationship going, it just continues to be harmful.
Yes. And then also, in the Eastern philosophy, if we start to shift towards seeing things as for our growth, right? Everything's for our
Yes,
favor, everything's for our growth. So taking out some
exactly.
of that strong emotional charge, like I've been wronged, but more, I've tapped into more strength inside of me,
Yes.
or I've grown from this. So, like you said, holding the coal, we're not the ones that continually get burned.
Yeah. So in my book, I've got exercises to work with the energy of anger. Because
Hmm.
really, there's nothing necessarily wrong with the energy of anger. It's like this volcanic energy, as long as it's allowed to flow freely inside of your body. And this is really important, as long as it's balanced with more of the yin energy of the tenderness. So I actually have a lot of practices where people can not suppress that angry energy, because if you do that, it's just going to pop out, but allow it to flow freely and kind of mix and mingle with the more heart-centered energy of the tenderness. And you can hold both. I'll admit it's challenging, but it is possible to hold both energies together. The really important thing is we don't want to judge ourselves for feeling angry or feel like we can't express our anger because it's not, people won't like us if we do. Because anger is part of the human experience. And so to the extent that we can channel our anger in a way that, again, it makes us focused, it makes us energized, it makes us courageous, it can help us feel strong. And if we do that, combined with the fact that, yes, everyone's a human being doing the best we can, and then those two energies combined can lead to a more powerful and really self-protective response. It's been a problem for women throughout the ages that they haven't been allowed to feel angry.
Mm.
It's been socialized out of them. And that's partly why, like, if you look at people who are predators, they don't tend to prey on women who get really angry because they're too much work. They prey on the woman who kind of, go along with it, or not going to say anything, because they're easier targets. And that's intentional. In other words, the history of power inequality has socialized anger out of women in part so that they won't be upset about the unequal power situation. And so that's where, we have to think of, where does power come into this as well? And we have to recognize power inequality where it's operating, and to the extent we can, try to stand up to it, because that's not compassionate.
Yeah. There's just these injustices, Kristen, that I was just thinking about a friend of mine who was date raped in college, and she told her parents, and she, wanted to do things, and her parents were like, this is going to go on so long, it's going to ruin your college career, it's going to go like this. So they told her to silence it, and she did. And so, now a couple decades later, she's in therapy, but just there's this suppressed anger. And
That's right.
there's a lot of, imagine how you would feel if your, parents were like not
And
support.
it's so common. It's
Yeah.
so common. And that's why we have to be able to risk with anger that, yeah, maybe we'll get a little too angry and maybe people won't like us as much, but at least we own our authentic self. At least we
Yeah.
still have our voice. Because the consequences, especially, that's largely why I wrote the book for women. The consequences have been so severe of suppressing that fierce side of woman just so that they'll play along and not make waves. And it's really harmed us. And there may even be a time when maybe things are a little bit out of balance. I think that's even okay if it's a developmental stage. What's really important is that we really start to speak up for ourselves and worry a little less about people's opinions of us, more about our opinions of ourselves,
Right. Well,
you
there's
know?
this transition stage I can say for myself, Kristen, where it's more, listening to my intuition, as you mentioned, coming back to
Yes.
balance because things can be suppressed. We have these patterns. So I know not to trust myself necessarily if I'm very emotional, but when I'm
Yeah.
calm and I can
Yeah.
hear like, this isn't right, or there's something going on here, it doesn't sit right with me. And then we can learn to trust, hey, I have to say something. I need to speak up, a boundary here, whatever it is.
That's right. So I don't know if you're familiar with internal family systems. It's a type of psychology developed by a man named Dick Schwartz.
Yes.
But
Do
I
an
think it was
ex-
very, yeah,
Yeah.
very insightful. We have different parts of ourselves, and usually that angry part is a protector part, and it's playing an important role for us. But if we don't allow that protector to be there, or if we judge it, or we think we shouldn't have it, what happens is it takes over the whole system, and so we have no awareness of some of the other voices that say, "Well, maybe you shouldn't send that email quite like that, or maybe you should rephrase that, or get some other perspectives."
Yes.
But when we accept that protector part, we thank it, and we really appreciate the role it's playing for us, then it doesn't have to take over the system. And then it can actually work with other parts, so that we can come up with like kind of a team based response, which is usually it can still be very strong, but a little more effective.
Mm-hmm. Well, in your book, Kristen, again, back to fierce self-compassion. And again, every time I see the title, I can't help but think of Kali. I love it so much.
Yeah.
So, what are some specific tools maybe you can share with us a little bit, which obviously go in much greater depth in the book, for anyone
Hmm.
that's saying, hey, I'm trying to, one of your chapters about caring for others without losing ourselves, or just
Yeah.
in practice. And you talked a little bit about, we talked about awareness and the three things, but what are some other tools that someone can, walk away with and start using maybe today?
Yeah. So there's something, I've got several different versions of what's called the self-compassion break in that book. The self-compassion break is what I mentioned, where you just bring in one part mindfulness, one part common humanity, and one part kindness. It's like, how do you bake a self-compassion cookie? Those are the ingredients. But in their fierce form, they take a unique form. So for instance, when the aim is to protect yourself, kindness manifests as bravery, right? Um, Common humanity manifests as a feeling of empowerment when we realize we aren't alone, when we realize that when we stand up and speak up for ourselves, we're speaking up for a lot of people, we're speaking up for our human rights. And mindfulness in this case is real clarity.
Mm,
So that I actually call it brave, empowered clarity, these three components, when it's used in the service of protecting ourselves. So you could, for instance, write a paragraph of clarity, just call it out. What's really happening? Just be courageous and say what's happening. Don't downplay it. Don't sweep it under the
in your
rug.
own journal.
In your own journal, for instance,
Yes. You don't
to
have
your
to
journal,
worry
or
about
maybe just to
someone.
yourself.
Yeah.
Right. Remember that whenever we go beyond the confines of our separate self, and we remember we're part of the larger whole, not only do we feel less ashamed, we also do feel more empowered. So reframing what you're going through, for instance, maybe someone's mistreating you at work. If you speak up with them, not only are you doing this for yourself, you're doing it for everyone else in a similar situation. And that can be very empowering, right? And then the bravery, for instance, feeling brave enough to speak out, knowing that it's actually an act of kindness, not only for you, but for everyone else who might find themselves in a similar position. So
Yes.
those are the types of things you can do, just remembering those three components as you deal with whatever challenge is facing you. Um, that's one way. And going back to the touch, which is another way, You know how you talked about hands on heart?
Yes.
It's a little more helpful for tender self-compassion, but with fierce self-compassion, a lot of it is like standing up straight, rolling your
Mm.
shoulders back. You can
Stance.
even do
Yeah.
like the Wonder Woman arms akimbo. Some of these kind of power poses, they can help you feel more empowered, especially body posture. That's another way you can allow that fierce energy to flow. So there are a lot of different ways that you can practice this. I think the biggest thing is remembering that you have the right to assert yourself, to protect yourself, to meet your own needs, and also to motivate a change if something isn't healthy, either in the situation or in your own behavior. But this
Right.
is part of your human rights.
Yes. Yes. And it has, when I think about, I was reading a book, I have 2 sons, and I was
Uh-huh.
reading them a book on Susan B. Anthony, and
Ah,
I just think, wow, like this was 100 years ago, right?
yeah.
It's like we weren't voting at a certain point, and then just how it shifted. And I think about, culturally, my mother came from the Philippines, which actually is more matriarchal, but there are,
Ah,
certain cultures where it's different.
yes.
There's just so much that goes into this, and here we are, this here, and then we had the opportunity to reframe things and shift things.
Right. Yeah, yeah, that's amazing. And also just to think about that, just like you're saying with your family, and
Yeah.
start to unpack what are the barriers that get in the way of you being your authentic self. Because what self-compassion is in many ways is asking yourself, who am I really? And giving
Yes.
yourself permission to meet your needs, to provide for your needs, to express yourself, to draw boundaries if you need to give yourself a break if that's what you need, to be tender.
Yes.
Really, it's no one else is going to do it. You may be lucky enough, but even if you're lucky enough to have a wonderful partner and friends, if you don't let that kindness in, or if you're really unkind to yourself, then it's going to fall on deaf ears, all the kindness of others. So in many ways, kindness has to start at home for it to really sink in and help support us.
This idea of authenticity is really interesting today, especially for teens, preteens,
Uh,
very young women in the world of TikTok, right? In social media,
yes,
because everybody has this online persona. Everybody's on their phone all day, as you know, Kristen. So I
yes,
always tell people we need space, we need some stillness, we need meditation, we need to get away
yes,
from the noise because it's even so hard for many. And many people say to me, I don't know who I really am. I don't even
yeah.
know when I'm hungry. I don't know what my authentic self is. I don't know what balance is because there's so many voices.
Yes. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I grew up before the onslaught of social media, and I can't imagine. It's so difficult now.
Yeah.
So it's hard enough just being in the
Right.
social world, wondering what other people are thinking of you, especially as an adolescent. But now you've got, concrete ways to focus on how many likes do I have, or what are people saying about me? Are they
Comments. Oh,
commenting on my video? It's a lot harder, and youth are really suffering because of it.
I think
So we
so.
actually have a self-compassion training program for teenagers, which is
Mm.
so helpful when kids can learn about the importance of being there for themselves and not to be so invested in what other people think of them.
Oh, good.
So this is where the difference of self-compassion and self-esteem comes in, which is one of the things I've emphasized in my work. So self-esteem, the word esteem, is a judgment or an evaluation of worth. Do I think I'm good? Do I think I'm bad? Am I kind of somewhere in between? And it's usually based on social approval, right? Also, appearance is a really big determinant. And then achievement and those things that are important to you, whether it's school or work or career. And so you might say self-esteem is a fair weather friend because sometimes it's there for you, but
Mm,
sometimes it's not. It deserts you when you fail or you feel rejected or you don't achieve what you want. Self-compassion is also a form of self-worth,
mm,
but it simply comes from being a flawed human being. You don't need to do anything other than being a human being to have self-compassion, which means it's a true and stable friend.
mm.
Other people may like you, or you may fail at something, or
Yes.
maybe you don't look the way you want to look,
Or
but you're
someone
still
breaks
a
up with
human being.
you. Yeah.
Yes. Therefore, your self-worth is unconditional. And that's a big reason why it's so much more powerful than self-esteem. And because it gives this stability, this unshakable core of self-worth that self-esteem doesn't. And so social media is all about self-esteem. Do people like me? Do I look a certain way? Because I want to feel good about myself. With self-compassion, you circumvent all that and just go straight to the core of, I'm worthy just because I'm a human being. I don't need all this to be worthy. And then your decision to take part in those things is going to depend on, is it something that interests me or not?
Right.
Maybe it is. That's great. But if not, I don't need to spend time with it.
Right. And my sense of self doesn't have to go up and down so much with what
Exactly.
other people think of me.
That's right. Yeah.
And also connecting more to our values, I would think, right? If we start to
Yes, absolutely. So if self-compassion is the question, asking yourself the question, what do I need to alleviate suffering, to be happy, to be well, then what you value is going to directly determine what you need, because people with very different
Yes,
values are going to have what they need to fulfill those are going to be very different. So even just asking the question, what's really important to me, is an
yes,
act of self-compassion, because it shows you care enough to ask yourself and inquire and spend some time clarifying your values. And when you
yes.
live a life that's in accord with your values, the research shows very clearly you'll feel like your life is more meaningful, you'll be more satisfied with your life, you'll be happier. So it's really worth doing.
Beautiful. Well, I think even having the conversation around
Yes.
self-compassion is so important because I hear a lot about compassion, not so much around self-compassion. So thank you so much for your wonderful book, Kristin. Once again, it's called Fierce Self-Compassion: How Women Can Harness Kindness to Speak Up, Claim Their Power, and Thrive. Is there anything else you want to share, Kristin, or where else can we find out more about you and your work and get this book?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one thing that was really exciting, a couple of months ago, I started something called the Self-Compassion Community.
Mm,
Because self-compassion isn't natural and our culture doesn't encourage it, I thought it would be really important to create like an online platform where people can help each other practice. So we have live events with me,
wonderful.
other self-compassion experts. We've got mentor sessions and a lot of different styles of learning. And so if people are interested in going farther, if you go to my website, selfcompassion.org, you can actually join the community. It's very inexpensive. It's real a heart's project of mine to really expand the ways that people can learn this skill, because it's not totally easy and it's not totally natural. And it really helps to do it with others who are thinking the same way that you are thinking about this. So,
Beautiful. Well, thank you
yeah,
for sharing that. We will link to it in the show notes as well as,
wonderful.
yes, directly to the book over at mysaluna.com. Remember that you will get a transcript of Kristin and I's conversation, these links, as well as other shows I think you would enjoy. So, Kristin, once again, thank you so much for sharing your heart, your wisdom, your Kali energy with us today.
uh, Thanks,
And
Kimberly.
and we will be
Yeah.
back here Thursday as always for our next Q&A show. Take great care and sending you all much love.